This is a gross abuse of power. It's an assault on the separation of powers. The notion that any president, via political appointees, could manipulate our democratic system to tap into personal data has the fingerprints of a dictatorship all over it.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. Whatever we learn next about the extraordinary occasion of a sitting White House counsel who emerged as the single most damaging witness to Donald J. Trump in the special counsel investigation into the ex-president's efforts to obstruct a probe into his ties with Russia. Don't lose sight of this. The DOJ spying on its own conduit to the president is something seriously screwed up. New York Times, citing two people familiar with the matter, reporting the bombshell revelation that White House counsel Don McGahn and his wife were spied on during the Trump presidency by the DOJ. And, this is important, that a gag order to keep it under wraps was extended through at least two Trump attorneys general. From that Times reporting, quote, "It is not clear what FBI agents were investigating, whether Mr. McGahn was their specific focus or whether he was swept up in a larger net because he had communicated with someone who was under scrutiny. Still, the disclosure that agents had collected data of a sitting White House counsel, which they kept secret for years, is extraordinary. NBC News has reached out to Apple and Don McGahn. We are yet to receive a response. But here's where this news may go from something extraordinary to a five-alarm political fire. The extreme measures taken to keep the collection of Mr. and Mrs. McGahn's private information secret for years. Times reporting this, quote, "Under Justice Department policy, gag orders for subpoenas may be renewed for up to a year at a time," suggesting that prosecutors went to court several times to prevent Apple from notifying the McGahns earlier. Then there's this from the Mueller investigation, a tiny detail that would strongly suggest that the theory that the McGahns' information was inadvertently swept up by the Mueller prosecutors might be less likely than other explanations. That in the final days of the obstruction probe, prosecutors asked McGahn to produce his own records to corroborate his communications with Trump around the former president's instruction to fire Mueller. As you remember, that was one of the flashpoints of the obstruction investigation. From Donald Trump versus the United States by Michael Schmidt. The investigators knew that McGahn had spoken on the phone with Trump that weekend. Maybe they thought if they could get McGahn's phone records, they could show that Trump had indeed been calling him. Prosecutor Andrew Goldstein went back to McGahn's attorney, Bill Burke, in late 2018 with a homework assignment. Please tell McGahn to get the phone records himself. This process took several weeks. But finally, McGahn received them in the mail and sent them to Burke, who in turn gave them to Goldstein of the Mueller probe. So it leaves us with the far darker scenario to contemplate. And still, it's just a theory, but a haunting one. Did Trump so successfully and so thoroughly corrupt his DOJ that McGahn's records were pursued around the same time he became a key witness for the Mueller investigation? And did the secrecy around that nearly unprecedented data collection from a sitting White House counsel, which was operationalized by multiple DOJ actors, signal a complete perversion of justice? Only time will tell. Speaker Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Schumer are calling for hearings on Capitol Hill. Also today, news that the top DOJ national security official who would have overseen any leak investigation is leaving at the end of next week. The obliteration of the rule of law under the disgraced ex-president is where we start this hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The aforementioned New York Times Washington correspondent Mike Schmidt is here. Also joining us, Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Department of Defense, and Frank Figliuzzi is here, former FBI assistant director for counterintelligence and host of the Bureau podcast. Lucky for us, especially today, all three MSNBC contributors. Mike Schmidt, take us through what you reported today in the New York Times about Don McGahn and his wife, Mrs. McGahn's data being collected.
Well, basically, as you were laying out, they found out about this 3 years after the fact. So this happens in February of 2018. It's a period of time that we now know that the FBI and the Justice Department were looking at a range of folks in a range of different leak investigations. It could be related to that. It could be related to something else. But it takes 3 years for them to find out about this, to find out the fact that the government had access to their personal information. And as you were saying, the biggest problem here with all of this is a problem of well, based on what we know, and we don't know everything about how this came about, but the biggest problem that we do know is the problem of perception, that this is exactly what Donald Trump wanted. It was in a period of time in which Donald Trump was calling McGahn a liar and a leaker. He was very upset about reports that McGahn had told Mueller about the attempts to fire Mueller. He tried to get McGahn 2 weeks before this subpoena was issued to go back on his story. And that, unfortunately, is the most that we know about this. It is very possible that McGahn's records could have been soaked up in another investigation, in another leak investigation. There were a ton of leaks in the first 6 months of the Trump administration that the intelligence community and the Justice Department believed needed to be looked at. Some of them having nothing to do with Donald Trump, some of them having a lot to do with Donald Trump. But that is where we sort of find ourselves in this story, trying to find out what it was that led federal prosecutors to go after these records. Did they know that the number and address that they were targeting was of McGahn's? Was it sloppy investigative work? Interestingly, there's a fair amount of silence from the Justice Department on this. As you were pointing out, Merrick Garland has put out a statement today about this. There is an Inspector General's investigation that has been referred. But at the same time, no explanation from the Justice Department about how this happened.
Mike Schmidt, if you could just take us under the hood in terms of how this works. I mean, and I understand the responsibility of giving the most generous explanation to our viewers, so we'll do that. Inadvertently, a sweep of seized data that you subpoena Apple for collects the sitting White House counsel. That job is supposed to be the only human being who talks to the United States Justice Department during a 4-year presidential term. Surely someone at the United States Justice Department became aware of it at some point, if not around the original subpoena, which had to have been signed by someone at the Justice Department, then around the 3 or 4 gag orders that were renewed based on your reporting. What kinds of people, what kinds of roles are involved in that?
Well, I think what you're hitting on is the notion that if this was a mistake, then you think that the Justice Department would have reached out to McGahn to say, hey, look, we were looking at something else. Your stuff got soaked up in this thing. You're obviously a very important person that was in the government at the time. You were the Justice Department's chief witness against the president and an existential threat to the presidency, to Donald Trump's presidency at the time. We just wanted to give you a heads up on this. Instead, the McGahn's learning of this through notification from their providers or from Apple or such. So you would think that this may have come across someone's desk earlier if it was something that was inadvertent. In terms of perception, one of the unfortunate things here is that here we are a few weeks into this story. We know that the Justice Department subpoenaed or tried to subpoena records from five sort of different entities. One bucket of those people was the enemy of the people, Donald Trump's biggest enemies, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. Okay, so those were the first 3. The next one we know about is Adam Schiff, the president's chief critic on Capitol Hill, who was leading the investigation into Russia's meddling in the election. The next one is Don McGahn, the chief witness against the president in the Mueller investigation. Look, my guess is there's other subpoenas out there and such, but the 5 that we know about fit very neatly into the category of the president's greatest enemies. And these are not enemies that Donald Trump talked about behind closed doors. These are enemies that Donald Trump tweeted about, that Donald Trump talked about in public interviews, in public statements on the South Lawn of the White House, and in private to his aides. And obviously, because of that, there is a lot of skepticism about what happened and hits on the underlying notion that when the president of the United States talks about using the Justice Department or using his powers to go after his rivals, disclosures about investigations will be negatively impacted by that, regardless of what went into those decisions.